The Cold Awake. It was Thursday, October 12, 2003. Arthur woke up first. His 66-year-old spine throbbed with a familiar, dull ache. The biting cold of the mountain air only made it worse. He was not on his plush mattress in the suburbs of Seattle. Instead, he was lying on a stiff, old bed. The coarse, unwashed wool blankets smelled of damp cedar and old dust. Beside him, Clara was already awake. She sat at the edge of the mattress, staring blankly at her hands. She still wore the same beige wool cardigan from 3 days ago. It was the clothes she put on for what Jillian and Maeve called a mountain retreat getaway. It was supposed to be a long overdue vacation to clear their minds, a trip they desperately needed after the tragic loss of their only son. But looking around, the room was small. It was roughly 12 by 14 feet, and it felt like a prison. The walls were unpeeled pine logs, oozing hardened, amber beads of sap. In the corner sat a heavy, cast-iron wood stove, cold and dark. Next to it was a manual cast-iron water pump over a small copper sink, a bucket of gray water sitting beneath it. "Arthur," Clara whispered, her voice cracking like dry autumn leaves. "Look at the table." On the rough-hewn oak table in the center of the cabin lay a pristine copy of the Seattle Daily Chronicle. The date on the newspaper was October 10, 2003. Arthur limped over, his scuffed leather boots scraping against the uneven floorboards. He picked up the paper. The front page of the regional section carried a headline that froze the blood in his veins. The headline stared back at them in bold, black ink. "Tragic accident at Stone Peak. Out-of-state travelers feared dead after car plunges into ravine." The article detailed how a sedan belonging to Washington residents Arthur and Clara Vance had veered off a sharp cliff during a violent storm. According to authorities, the couple was traveling through the mountains alongside their caretakers, who were driving in a separate vehicle just ahead of them. The caretakers reported seeing headlights disappear into the darkness in their rearview mirror. Search and rescue teams later found the Vance vehicle crushed and burned at the bottom of the rocky gorge. But because of the raging river below, the bodies were missing, presumed swept away. The article quoted Julian, the couple's trusted caretaker. He was described as weeping openly at the scene, holding tightly to his girlfriend, Maeve, for support. Julian told local reporters, quote, "We are absolutely devastated. They worked so hard in their younger years. After losing their only child, their son, who was my best friend, they just wanted to get away. They asked us to drive down here with them, to find a quiet cabin or a hotel, so they could finally enjoy their retirement and clear their minds. We were supposed to look after them. We are praying for a miracle and holding on to hope that they are still alive out there somewhere." That was the end of a quote. Beneath the newspaper was a neatly handwritten note from Julian. "We don't want you dead. That's why we left the cellar stocked. There are enough canned beans, dried rice, and salted pork down there to last you 5 years. There is a solar panel on the roof that powers the single laptop on the desk, but there is no internet, no cellular towers for 40 miles, and no roads. The car accident was staged perfectly. To the world, you're dead. Enjoy your retirement." Arthur dropped the paper. He rushed over to the living room window. Outside, a dense forest of ancient Sitka spruce and Douglas fir trees pressed against the cabin like bars of a green cage. A lone stellar jay shrieked from a branch, the only sound in a terrifyingly isolated world. They were completely cut off, stripped of their lives, their home, and their very identities. And the worst part? It was done by the people they put their faith and trust in the most. They were left out in the middle of nowhere. But despite the betrayal, they still had each other, and have a roof over their heads, food and water. The grim realization. The grandfather clock in the corner of the cabin ticked with a heavy, mocking rhythm. The date was still Thursday, October 12, 2003, just 3 days since they were drugged and brought here. Arthur's hands shook as he turned Julian's note over. On the back, written in the same neat, elegant cursive script, was the true, terrifying logic of their captivity. P.S. We know you are smart, Arthur. You know that without bodies, the state of Washington takes 7 long years to declare you legally dead. 7 years before the insurance policies clear and the house title transfers entirely to us. If you die out there before then and someone finds you, we go to prison. So here is our pact. Every 6 months, on April 12th and October 12th, we will leave fresh supplies, medication, and fuel at the marker stone by the dry creek bed 3 miles south. We will not see you. We will not talk to you. If you attempt to follow us or leave the perimeter, the supplies stop permanently. Live comfortably, stay put, and let's have a life you no longer need. Clara pulled the colorful handmade crochet blanket, one she had spent 3 months stitching last winter, tighter around her shoulders. Julian and Maeve had even stolen their blankets from home to pack for them. It was a sickening level of thoughtfulness. She looked down at the floorboards. Right beneath Arthur's scuffed leather boots was a heavy iron ring attached to a square piece of timber, the trapdoor to the cellar. "Help me lift it, Artie," she whispered, her voice tightening with a mix of grief and survival instinct. Arthur groaned, gripping his lower back as he pulled the iron ring. The heavy-wood groaned, releasing the smell of damp earth, stored potatoes, and metallic tin. Below, a ladder led into a dark pit. Arthur struck a match, the small yellow flame illuminating rows of wooden shelves neatly packed with hundreds of identical, unlabeled silver cans, heavy burlap sacks of rice, and a massive water cistern connected to a deep underground well. They weren't meant to starve. They were meant to be kept like livestock in a hidden cage for the next 7 years. Clara stood up, her floral cotton dress rustling in the quiet cabin. She walked to the small desk where the laptop sat. It was an old, rugged Panasonic Toughbook, its screen glowing in the dim cabin light. It was connected by a thick gray wire to a small solar inverter on the windowsill. She opened the screen. There was no internet icon, no browser. Only a single folder on the desktop titled Entertainment. Inside were digital copies of board games, chess, checkers, and solitaire, and a massive library of scanned classic books. They were completely wealthy in supplies, but utterly bankrupt in freedom. The date on the rusted iron calendar wheel read Monday, October 16th, 2003. For days had passed since the discovery of the newspaper. Arthur stood in the center of the cabin, a rag tied over his mouth to block the thick, gray dust. Clara was beside him, her faded beige wool cardigan sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The shock of the betrayal had settled into a heavy, quiet resolve. "They could have left us in the woods with nothing, Artie," Clara said, her voice steady as she wiped down a pine shelf with a damp cloth. "We could be real corpses at the bottom of Stone Peak right now. We are alive. We have shelter." Arthur nodded, his chest tightening with affection for his wife's resilience. "Then let's make this place livable." Together, they spent the day reorganizing the cramped space. They dragged the worn-out, tattered plaid couch away from the dark corner and placed it right under the wider, western-facing window. Now, the dim afternoon sun bathed the fabric in a warm, amber glow. Arthur stepped onto the heavy iron ring of the cellar trapdoor, ensuring it slammed completely shut. The wood fit perfectly flush with the rest of the floorboards. He dragged a heavy, braided oval rug over the top of it. The entrance to their survival stash was now completely hidden flat, and located just 3 feet away from the safety of the cast-iron wood stove. In the back of the cabin, a small doorless archway led into a storage room no bigger than a walk-in closet. Inside, stacked 3 layers deep, were heavy cardboard boxes sealed with yellowing packing tape. Clara sliced the tape open using a rusted butter knife from the copper sink. Inside the first box were dozens of paperback novels, their spines cracked and pages yellowed, smelling heavily of vanilla and old paper. The second box contained extra clothes, thick denim overalls, oversized wool socks, and heavy winter coats that looked 20 years old but were perfectly clean. The third box brought a genuine smile to Clara's face. It was filled with old physical board games, Monopoly, Scrabble, and Clue, their cardboard boxes worn at the edges. Beneath them lay a stack of old VHS videotapes and a small, heavy 1990s box television with a built-in VCR player. It was an ancient setup, but it didn't need the internet to work. While Clara organized the dishes and aired out the musty blankets, Arthur walked out the back door to a small, leaning lean-to shed. Inside, the air smelled of rust and dry cedar. To his absolute delight, the caretakers had left a treasure trove of old woodworking supplies. Rows of handsaws, rasps, chisels, sanders, and cans of half-used wood stains sat on a dusty workbench. Julian knew Arthur loved carpentry. Leaving these tools was a calculated move to keep the 66-year-old occupied, so he wouldn't try to escape. Arthur grabbed a block of rough 80 grit sandpaper and a can of dark walnut stain and walked back inside. Clara was sitting on the couch, wincing as she pulled a sharp, jagged pine splinter from her palm. The rough-hewn oak coffee table in front of her was completely unfinished, its edges splintered and hazardous. "Don't touch it again just yet, Claire," Arthur said softly, kneeling down in front of the table. For the next 3 days, the cabin was filled with the rhythmic, soothing sound of sandpaper scraping against wood. Arthur sanded away the rough edges, smoothing down the sharp corners until the oak felt like silk under his fingertips. He wiped away the fine white sawdust and carefully applied 2 coats of the dark walnut stain. By Friday, the coffee table gleamed under the window's light. The room felt brighter, aired out, and clean. They had transformed a dusty wilderness cabin into a home. They were still far from the city, but they still had each other. Another day of isolation. The date on the rusted iron calendar will read Saturday, October 24th, 2003. Outside, the first gentle flurries of early winter snow began to dance against the wider window pane. Inside, the cast iron wood stove crackled softly, throwing a warm, flickering orange glow across the newly sanded oak coffee table. Arthur had built a modest fire, the scent of burning cedar filling the room and masking the smell of the old cabin logs. Clara sat on the tattered plaid couch, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of hot water steeping with dried dandelion roots she had harvested from the stream bank. Her rheumatoid arthritis throbbed in the dropping temperature, but the heavy wool socks and the warmth of the fire kept the pain manageable. Arthur sat beside her, gently taking her left hand into his rough, calloused palms. He began to rub her knuckles, his thumbs working in slow, rhythmic circles to ease the swelling. It was an old routine, one they hadn't done in years. "It's funny, Claire," Arthur said softly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "For the last 4 years, since the accident, I feel like we were already living in a cabin just like this. We were so quiet. We didn't talk. We just existed." Clara leaned her head against his flannel-covered shoulder. A tear slipped down her cheek, sparkling in the firelight. "We stopped being Arthur and Clara the day Leo died. We were just 2 ghosts waiting for our turn." Old friends and family members, over time, would learn the truth of their small family issue. For 15 years after their wedding, Arthur and Clara had tried to conceive. Doctor after doctor in the late 1980s told them the same clinical, devastating truth. Both of them had reproductive complications. Their chances of having a child were statistically 0. They had mourned that loss, accepted it, and poured all their love into their marriage and their careers. And then, at age 38, the miracle happened. Leo was born. He was a surprise that defied every medical chart. Because he was their only child, their entire universe revolved around him. When his motorcycle veered off that rainy Seattle highway 4 years ago, their universe completely collapsed. That collapse was exactly how Julian and Maeve crept into their lives. Julian had been Leo's best friend since middle school. He knew how desperate the aging couple was for a connection to their dead son. Julian would sit on their old living room couch, drinking their coffee, talking about what Leo would have wanted. Every time Clara's hands were too stiff to cook, Maeve would bring over a casserole. Every time the house needed a gutter cleaned, Julian was there with a ladder. They wore the masks of grieving, devoted surrogate children. Arthur and Clara trusted them implicitly because they looked at Julian and saw a piece of Leo. When Julian brought over the living trust documents, saying it was just to protect their assets from government taxes as they got older, Arthur signed it without reading a single line. They simply didn't care about money anymore. "They targeted our grief, Artie," Clara whispered, her voice tightening with a sudden, sharp clarity. "They didn't just steal our house. They used our love for our boy to trap us." Arthur stopped rubbing her hand and looked her directly in the eyes. For the first time in 4 years, the dull, defeated look in his eyes was replaced by a spark of fierce, protective anger. "They thought they were burying us out here, Claire," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, determined register. "But they forgot something. Before we were Leo's parents, we were survivors. We built a life out of nothing once before. We are going to do it again." For the first time since the tragedy, they didn't feel the crushing weight of depression. The betrayal had shocked their systems back to life. Julian and Maeve hadn't just given them a prison, they had accidentally given them a reason to fight again. The shadows of the past and the endless forest. The fire in the cast-iron stove popped, throwing small sparks against the thick glass window. If anyone, a doctor, a nurse, or an old acquaintance, had asked Arthur and Clara about those heavy years in the late 1980s, they would have heard a story of quiet, exhausting endurance. The blood work, the invasive lab tests, the sterile clinic waiting rooms. All of it pointed to the same cold, medical dead end. Both of them carried reproductive complications that made conception a statistical impossibility. In those days, their social circles slowly began to fracture. Nosy family members dropped hints at holiday dinners, asking when they were going to start a real family. Over time, as their peers entered the world of strollers, PTA meetings, and youth sports, the invitations stopped coming. The awkwardness of being the child-free couple in a world built for parents drove a wedge between them and their old friends. People didn't know what to say, so they said nothing at all. Schedules grew busy, and older family members passed away. Arthur grew up as an only child, as did Clara. Both of their parents had no siblings either. When they tragically lost their only son, their family tree completely withered away. They had no brothers, no sisters, no aunts, no uncles, and now no child left in the world to wonder where they had gone. They were entirely alone, making them the perfect, invisible targets for Julian and Maeve's cruel plan. "What if we just walk, Artie?" Clara asked, staring into the dark corners of the cabin. "Pack the woolen blankets, take 3 days of rations from the cellar, and just head south toward that dry creek bed Julian mentioned." Arthur sighed, his 66-year-old knees cracking as he stood up to pace the small room. He walked to the window, rubbing a circle into the condensation on the glass. "I thought about it, Claire," Arthur said, his voice heavy with practical reality. "But look out there." Through the glass, the mountain wilderness was an intimidating wall of ancient Douglas firs and dense undergrowth. There were no paths, no clearings, and no signs of human life. At 60 and 66, with Clara's rheumatoid arthritis flaring in the cold and Arthur's chronic lower back pain, a trek into an unmarked mountain range was a death sentence. If a sudden blizzard hit, or if one of them took a bad fall and broke an ankle on the jagged granite rocks, they would freeze to death within hours. They didn't know if they were 40 miles from civilization or 400. Julian and Maeve had picked this spot precisely because it was a perfect, inescapable green maze. Turning back to the safety of the cabin wasn't a choice. It was their only logical option for survival. "We stay," Arthur said firmly, turning back to face her. "We use their supplies, we build up our strength, and we wait. We don't die in the woods just to make it easy for them." The map in the pages. The date on the calendar wheel read Friday, November 13th, 2003. A thick, heavy blanket of snow now covered the cabin roof, keeping the heat from the cast-iron stove trapped inside. To keep their minds sharp and block out the painful thoughts of Julian and Maeve's betrayal, Arthur and Clara started a new afternoon routine. Every day after lunch, they would sit on the tattered plaid couch under the wide window and read to each other from the boxes of old paperback books they had cleaned. Clara was holding a worn, water-stained copy of an old 1970s Western novel. As she opened the cover to begin Chapter 4, her fingers brushed against something stiff tucked deep between the yellowing pages. "Artie, hold on," Clara said, her voice dropping. She carefully pulled out a folded piece of thick, grid-lined paper. It wasn't part of the book. It was a hand-drawn topographical map, sketched in faded blue ballpoint ink. Arthur leaned in close, his flannel shoulder pressing against hers. The map showed a detailed layout of the surrounding wilderness. In the center was a tiny square labeled cabin. Leading south from the cabin was a dotted line that marked a trail through the dense pine trees, ending at a large X-labeled Dry Creek supply drop. But it was the top corner of the paper that made Arthur's heart race. Written in crisp, engineering handwriting from whoever had built the cabin decades ago, were exact geographic coordinates. 48 degrees, 24 minutes, 15.2 seconds north, 121 degrees, 10 minutes, 34.8 seconds west. Clara's botanist brain instantly clicked. Artie, 121 degrees west. That's the North Cascades. We aren't in another state. We are still in Washington, deep inside the National Forest. Beneath the coordinates, the old mapmaker had drawn a small arrow pointing northeast, past the dense tree line, with a note. 15 miles to Diablo Dam Road. High elevation. Dangerous trek. 15 miles. To a young, healthy hiker, it was a one-day trip. To a 60-year-old woman with severe arthritis and a 66-year-old man with a bad back, 15 miles of trackless, snowy mountain terrain in the dead of winter was still impossible. But for the first time in a month, they had a target. They knew exactly where they were, and they knew exactly how far civilization was. They just needed to survive the winter, build up their physical strength, and wait for the snow to melt in the spring. The winter solstice and the long night. The date on the iron calendar will read Monday, December 21st, 2003. It was the winter solstice, the shortest day and the longest, darkest night of the year. Outside, a ferocious mountain blizzard howled through the high peaks of the North Cascades. The wind slammed against the heavy log walls of the cabin, making the pine timber groan under the pressure. Snow piled up high, completely burying the bottom half of the wide western window. Inside, however, the cabin was a fortress of warmth. Arthur had spent the last 2 weeks using his carpentry skills to weatherproof every single crack in the window frames using old rags and strips of dried leather he found in the lean-to shed. The cast iron wood stove glowed a dull, comforting red, throwing a deep heat into the room that kept the freezing mountain air at bay. On the newly sanded walnut coffee table, Clara had set up an old cardboard board game of Scrabble they had cleaned of dust weeks ago. A single oil lamp sat between them, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. "Your turn, Artie," Clara said softly, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. She wore a thick denim button-down shirt over her wool cardigan to layer against the chill. Arthur looked down at his wooden letter tiles. He carefully placed 5 letters onto the grid, intersecting with Clara's previous word. He spelled out, H-O-P. "A bit on the nose, don't you think?" Clara teased gently, though her eyes softened. "It's what we have, Claire," Arthur replied, his voice steady and grounded. Over the last 2 months, the grueling physical labor of survival had done something miraculous to their aging bodies. Arthur's chronic back pain, though still present, had dulled significantly because his core muscles had grown stronger from lifting and stacking heavy cedar logs every morning. Clara's hands, once stiff and nearly locked from rheumatoid arthritis, had regained a surprising amount of dexterity. The daily routine of pumping water, scrubbing floors, and kneading flatbread from the cellar's flour supply acted as a forced physical therapy. They were eating simple, clean meals of brown rice, salted pork, and dandelion teas. They weren't just surviving the winter, they were physically transforming. Later that night, after finishing the game, Arthur turned on the heavy, rugged Panasonic laptop. The solar battery on the windowsill was low due to the storm, but it had just enough charge for an hour of power. Clara sat beside him as he opened a blank text document. "If we don't make out of these mountains, Claire," Arthur said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, "the world needs to know what Julian and Maeve did. We leave a digital record. We type every date, every bank account number, every lie they told us. We save it to a flash drive and hide it under the floorboards." Clara nodded, her jaw tightening. "Start with the day Leo died, Artie. Start with the day they walked into our home, into our lives, pretending to care this whole time when it all was just a lie." The rhythmic clicking of a laptop keys joined the howling of the mountain wind. They were writing their confession, their evidence, and their weapon. Julian and Maeve thought they had left 2 fragile, broken seniors to fade away in the woods. They had no idea that deep in the snow-covered peaks, the 2 were defying the odds. Word by word, A journal of their lives was being typed into existence. The date on the iron calendar will read Wednesday, March 10th, 2004. The brutal winter was finally losing its grip on the North Cascades. Patchy, melting snow revealed the damp, dark earth beneath the towering Douglas firs. Clara sat on the edge of the mattress, her knees swollen from a severe spring damp flare-up. Her joints throbbed with a relentless, burning heat. There was no cure for her rheumatoid arthritis out here, and their small supply of store-bought pain cream was completely empty. "I can't clear the kitchen table today, Artie," Clara murmured, her jaw clenched against the pain. "My fingers won't close." Arthur knelt by her side, wrapping his large, warm hands around her swollen wrists. "You don't have to lift a finger today, Claire. Let me be your hands." But Clara wasn't defeated. Her 30 years of botanical research field trips weren't just for a paycheck. They were now a survival asset. Later that afternoon, Arthur walked out to the edge of the melting creek bed, carrying a small carving knife and a burlap sack. Following Clara's precise instructions, he located a stand of young Pacific willows growing near the water. He carefully peeled away small strips of the green, pliable outer bark, revealing the moist, white inner layer. Back in the cabin, Arthur boiled the white inner willow bark in a pot of water on the cast-iron stove. The cabin filled with a bitter, medicinal aroma. Clara drank the murky tea slowly. It tasted awful, but within an hour, the natural salicin began to block the pain signals in her nervous system. It didn't cure the arthritis. Her joints were still visibly swollen, but it dulled the sharp, agonizing edge of the pain enough for her to sit up and breathe easily. To supplement their heavy, nutrient-bankrupt diet of canned white rice and salted pork, Clara became meticulous about their health. She had Arthur dig up the early sprouting roots and green leaves of the wild dandelions piercing through the snow. Packed with iron, calcium, and essential vitamins, the bitter greens kept their immune system strong, preventing the sluggish fatigue of winter scurvy. Survival hygiene required ingenuity too. To stretch their dwindling supply of 24 store-bought lye soap bars, they looked to the wood stove. Arthur collected the cold, white hardwood ash from the belly of the stove and mixed it into a barrel of collected rainwater on the porch, letting it sit and soak over days. The chemical reaction created a crude, slippery lye water. Clara used this alkaline mixture to scrub the heavy grease off their iron cooking pans and wash Arthur's dirty flannel shirts. They also saved the black lumps of charcoal from the fire. Arthur crushed the charcoal into a fine powder and layered it inside a hollowed-out log filled with sand and gravel, creating a primitive but highly effective water filtration system. Every drop of water they pumped from the ground was run through this charcoal filter, ensuring it was crystal clear and free of mountain bacteria. By the end of March, they had established a rhythm of primitive chemistry. They were still aging, still aching, and still captive. But through willow bark, dandelions, and wood ash, they had seized control of their health. They were surviving on their own terms, waiting for the day of the first supply drop. The distant engine. The date on the iron calendar wheel read Saturday, May 15th, 2004. Spring had fully arrived in the North Cascades. The thick snow had melted into roaring mountain streams, and the dense forest canopy vibrated with the chirping of evening grosbeaks. Arthur was out back by the woodpile, splitting thick rounds of cedar with a heavy iron maul. Suddenly he froze. His 66-year-old ears caught a faint, mechanical rumble echoing through the canyon. It wasn't the sound of Julian's rugged Jeep. Julian only ever approached from the trackless South Ridge where the dry creek bed lay. This sound came from the deep, uncharted north. It was the unmistakable chug of a rusted, working engine. Arthur dropped the maul, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hurried inside the cabin, slamming the heavy pine door behind him. "Clara," he gasped, gripping his aching lower back. "A car. Someone is driving up from the North Gorge." Clara stood up from the tattered plaid couch, her hands trembling as she adjusted her faded beige wool cardigan. For 7 months, they had seen absolutely nobody. They peered together through the wide western window. Emerging from a narrow, overgrown logging trail that wasn't even visible from their yard was a battered, mud-splattered 1990s Subaru Outback. The vehicle bounced over the deep ruts and came to a halt in the center of their small clearing. The driver's side door creaked open. A young woman stepped out, wearing a heavy canvas utility jacket, scuffed work boots, and her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked to be around 26 years old. But what caught Clara's breath was a small 4-year-old boy in a faded blue hoodie sitting securely in the back seat, staring curiously through the car window. The woman held an old, rusted iron key in her hand, looking completely bewildered as she stared at the freshly scrubbed cabin porch, the neatly stacked woodpile, and the smoke rising from the cast-iron stove. She walked up the steps, her boots thudding loudly on the wood. Before she could even knock, Arthur pulled the door open. The woman jumped back, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, clutching her jacket. "I didn't think anyone was up here. This cabin is supposed to be abandoned. It belonged to an old boyfriend of mine. He disappeared 4 years ago." Clara stepped forward, her voice soft but cautious. "Who was your boyfriend, dear?" The young woman sighed, looking down at the rusted key in her palm. "He went by the name of Thomas. Thomas Vance." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Arthur went completely rigid. Thomas was Leo's middle name, the name they had given him after Clara's late father. The young woman's name was Maya, and the 4-year-old boy playing quietly with a wooden block on the cabin floor was Liam. As Maya sat on the newly sanded walnut coffee table, sipping a warm mug of Clara's bitter willow bark tea, the pieces of a hidden life began to shatter the room. "Thomas and his best friend Julian found this place back in college," Maya explained, her eyes tracking the room. "They used it as a secret getaway to camp and drink beer. Julian's uncle owned the land, but he abandoned it decades ago. When Thomas and I started dating, he brought me up here. It was our spot." She looked at Arthur and Clara, her brow furrowing with confusion. "Thomas kept his family life completely separate from me. He always said he wanted to wait until the time was right. He told me his parents were good people, but he wanted to prove he could build a life on his own first. He was a mechanic. He used to drive his motorcycle up here via the old northern logging road. It's a rough dirt path, but it connects directly to the state highway 15 miles away." Maya's voice cracked, a deep, 4-year-old grief breaking through her calm exterior. "The last time I saw him was May 1999. I called him and told him I was pregnant. He was shocked on the phone, totally silent. But later that night, he showed up at my place. He surprised me with a ring, held me close, and told me he had to take care of a few things and go visit his parents down in Seattle to tell them everything. He said he'd bring them right back here to finally introduce us. He left that same night on his motorcycle." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the cabin. "He never came back," Maya whispered, a tear falling onto her canvas jacket. "He never showed up back at this cabin. I tried contacting Julian, and I called his co-workers at the shop, but no one knew anything. I thought he abandoned us because of the baby. I've been struggling alone down in the valley for 4 years, raising Liam by myself. But lately, things got worse. I lost my job, rent is coming up, and I just couldn't afford it anymore. I hadn't been back to this place in over a year, but I remembered it was empty. I thought, since no one was living here, Liam and I could stay temporarily. Just use what little savings I have left until I can find another job." Arthur felt a sob tear through his chest. He sank onto the couch, covering his face with his calloused, worn hands. "Maya," Clara said, her voice shaking so violently she could barely speak. She walked over and gently placed a photograph on the table. A small, faded photo of a smiling young man on a motorcycle that she had carried in her cardigan pocket for years. His name wasn't Thomas. His name was Leo Thomas Vance. He didn't abandon you. Maya stared at the photograph, her breath hitching. "That's him, that's my Thomas. He was our only son," Clara wept, reaching out to touch Maya's trembling hand. "He didn't run away from you, sweetie. He died in a motorcycle crash that very night on his way to see us." The convergence of truth. The revelation struck the cabin like a lightning bolt. Maya looked from the photograph of Leo to the elderly couple and then down at little Liam, who had the exact same striking gray eyes as the father he had never met. But the sorrow instantly shifted into a terrifying puzzle. "Wait," Maya said, her eyes widening as she looked around the meticulously clean cabin, the stock shelves, and the yellow legal pad filled with inventory lists. "If Leo died 4 years ago, and you are his parents, what are you doing up here? Why are you living in his old hidden cabin?" Arthur stood up, his posture straightening with a fierce, burning anger. He walked over to the desk and picked up the pristine, 7-month-old copy of the Seattle Daily Chronicle and the typed confession on the Panasonic laptop. "Because of Julian," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "The man you knew as Leo's best friend." Over the next hour, Arthur and Clara laid out the entire horrific truth. They told Maya about their crushing grief, about how Julian and Maeve had systematically wormed their way into their lives as fake caregivers, and how they were drugged, kidnapped, and brought to this mountain prison so the caretakers could fake their deaths and steal their estate. Maya listened, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her tea mug. The puzzle pieces of the last 4 years were finally clicking into place. "Julian told me he didn't know what happened to Thomas either," Maya whispered, her teeth clenched in pure rage. "He pretended to help me look for him. But Julian knew this cabin was here. He knew it was the most isolated place on Earth. He used Leo's secret sanctuary to build a cage for Leo's parents." She stood up, looking out the wide window toward the northern logging road where her Subaru was parked. "Julian's road to the south is blocked by a dry creek bed and requires a massive 4x4 Jeep," Maya said, a sharp, tactical look entering her eyes. "But my road, the old northern logging trail, it's rough. But my Subaru can clear it. It goes straight to the highway. Arthur, Clara, grab your blankets. Grab the laptop with the evidence files. We are getting you out of here right now." Arthur and Clara looked at each other. For 7 long months, they had accepted their fate as living ghosts, waiting for a spring thaw just to try a desperate, life-threatening 15-mile foot trek. Now standing in their living room was the daughter-in-law and a grandson they never knew existed, with a vehicle capable of breaking their chains. "Pack the legal pad, Artie," Clara said, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking through her tears. "Our cabin stay is finally over." "The road is open, Arthur," Maya whispered, her keys jingling in her hand. "We can load your blankets, get in my Subaru, and be on the highway before sunset." Arthur looked at the door, his heart pounding, but then his eyes dropped to little Liam, who was happily stacking wood blocks on the rug. Arthur's carpentry mind, always calculating structures and consequences, suddenly saw the deadly flaw in a quick escape. "No," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a sharp, urgent whisper. "We can't just leave, Maya. Think about it. Julian knows you. He knew you were Leo's girlfriend, and he knows this cabin was Leo's secret spot. If we flee right now, Julian will show up for the supply drop in 2 days and find this cabin empty. He'll see your tire tracks." Clara's hand flew to her mouth as the horrific logic clicked in her mind. "Oh my God, Artie, you're right. Julian is holding a multi-million-dollar trust over our heads. If he realizes we escaped, he faces lifetime imprisonment. A desperate animal does desperate things." "Exactly," Arthur nodded grimly. "If he panics, he won't just run from the law. He will come looking for the person who ruined his life. He knows where you live down in the valley, Maya. If we aren't careful, Julian and Maeve could hunt you down. They could kidnap Liam to blackmail us into silence, or worse." The sheer weight of the unknown danger chilled the room. Fleeing blindly was an escape. It was inviting a predator into their daughter-in-law and grandson's lives. The stakes were no longer just about Arthur and Clara's freedom. It was about protecting the life of their daughter-in-law, Maya, and the life of their innocent grandbaby, Liam. They were the only living connection left of their late son, Leo. Instead of fleeing immediately, Arthur, Clara, and Maya stood around the newly sanded walnut coffee table, analyzing the terrifying reality of the situation. "We don't run," Clara said, her voice turning to steel as she wrapped her arm around Maya's shoulder. "We'll just stay here. It's for the best, so you and Liam don't get involved with them. You head back into town. We will use their own trap against them by just being patient and staying put." Maya took the newspaper article from the Van Cess, grabbed her son, and bundled Liam back into the Subaru. She drove straight back down the mountain to the nearest police station, where she laid out the article and explained the situation. The authorities took over immediately, and within 72 hours, those two crooks were handcuffed and behind bars. A new day on the ridge. 6 months later, the date on the iron calendar will read November 17, 2004. The courtroom drama in Seattle had been a media sensation, but the legal resolution took an unexpected, deeply emotional turn. Arthur and Clara had recovered their paid-off ranch home, their $45,000 savings, and the full rights to their life insurance policies. When it came time for the final sentencing, Arthur and Clara did a shocking thing. They requested the judge show a degree of leniency, reducing the absolute maximum sentence for Julian and Maeve. The lawyers were baffled, but to Arthur and Clara, the logic was profoundly spiritual. If those two hadn't abandoned us in that cabin, Arthur stated to the courtroom, his voice echoing with absolute dignity, we would have spent the rest of our lives fading away as depressed ghosts in our living room. And we would have never, ever found out about our grandson. What Julian and Maeve meant for evil, the universe turned into our greatest blessing. They didn't forgive the crime, but they chose to leave the bitterness behind in the mountains. Now, the scene inside their Seattle suburban home was full of light, noise, and life. The rough-hewn oak coffee table from the cabin had been brought back with them, sitting proudly in the center of their bright, modern living room. Its dark walnut stain gleamed under the warm afternoon sun. Maya had officially moved into the large upstairs bedroom, transforming it into a photo studio. She had become the daughter they never had, helping Clara manage her daily arthritis treatments and driving Arthur to his carpentry supply stores. Down on the plush living room rug, little Liam was playing with a set of wooden blocks Arthur had hand-carved for him in his new garage workshop. Clara sat on the sofa, her hands completely relaxed, watching her grandson build a tiny wooden tower. They weren't a conventional family, and they had traveled through a literal hell of betrayal and isolation to get here. But as Arthur walked into the living room carrying a fresh tray of coffee and a glass of juice for Liam, he looked at his wife and smiled. That grim heaviness they had carried for years after Leo's passing, the pain of outliving their only child, the loneliness, the betrayal, the endless feeling of simply surviving, had finally begun to fade. In its place came something neither of them ever expected to find again: hope. A grandson, a daughter, a home that no longer felt cold or empty. Together, they helped one another heal from the wounds of the past, knowing there were still better days ahead. What began as a cruel act of betrayal had led to a shocking miracle neither of them could have imagined. And now, Mr. and Mrs. Vance planned to spend the rest of their years holding on tightly to the little family that had found them. Abandoned, trapped, isolated. Yet, in the end, what they found was a miracle. Or perhaps, a miracle that had found them when they truly needed it the most.